Hello everyone, and welcome to Create with Kiely. I'm Kiely, and today we're going to be looking at different watercolor techniques. Let's begin by creating a worksheet that is divided into 8 rectangles, and in the bottom 2 rectangles, I'd like you to draw 2 round shapes in each of the rectangles. There's 1 and 2, and that third to last rectangle, divide that one in 2. Now let's label the boxes so you understand which techniques we're using, and you can use this as a reference sheet later when you start painting in watercolors. In the first box, we're going to label it direct painting, and this is your most normal way of painting where you have a wet puddle of paint and you apply that onto dry paper. Then we have wet paint on a wet paper, dry paint on dry paper, dry paint on wet paper, and this other technique, it's super cool. It's called a flat wash, and there's a couple of varieties of doing washes, and I'm going to show you 2 over here with 2 different kinds of graded wash. In the last 2 rectangles, label it wash around wet and wash around dry. So you're going to need a paintbrush, of course, your palette of paints, and I use 2 paints, so there's my collection, and of course some water. All right, let's begin. If you're using 2 paints, squeeze out some fresh paint for yourself, a little bit of water, and just have fun doing some strokes across the rectangle. And you can see how watercolor can be opaque and transparent depending on how much water and how much paint is on your brush. In box number 2, just take some clean water and wet it, and then apply the wet paint onto the wet surface. And you're going to notice how watercolor paints will move around on the wet surface, and that's osmosis happening for all you scientists out there, where it likes to move into wet areas, and you can play around with this. It's very beautiful, where it bleeds into one color, how 2 colors put together will mix together. You can see how I only used yellow and blue, and there's this lovely green that's being formed. And if you move your page around a bit, you can control where the water runs and control how the paint moves on the paper. You get a really nice effect with this. This is a really lovely, therapeutic kind of way of painting where it's fun to just watch the colors bleed into one another. The next technique is dry on dry, where you can visibly see the brush strokes, where you can see the bristles. It's a good texture effect. And here I'm going to make a mistake, and I want you to notice how easy it is to fix the mistake. Just some clean water and a little dab. There you go. It's all gone. Can't do that too much, but it is possible to fix mistakes. And in the next one, pre-wet the paper again and take that dry paint and do the same thing, and you'll notice that you have the combination of the texture of brush strokes with the bleeding effect from the wet on wet. I'm also doing those 2 colors so you can see how watercolor paints can be transparent, and you can see one color under the next. On to the washes. Now this is a little trickier technique. You need to hold your paper at a 45-degree angle, and you're using gravity to your benefit. Each brush stroke will have a pooling of paint and water at the bottom of the stroke, and you're going to pick that beading of water up with your next stroke so that you move the wet paint down the surface of the page, and you should have a pretty solid looking fill of the space that you're trying to fill in. Next is a graded wash, and notice that instead of going back to the puddle of paint and picking up more pigment, this time I'm dipping into the water repeatedly to gradually wash off the paint and rinse it out, so I have a very saturated color to a very clear light yellow. Next is a graded wash where we transition between 2 colors, and I'm starting with the blue, and it's the same thing as that first one. If you make a little mistake, just rinse and dab. Then I will transition to that second color and blend them in and let the two colors bleed into each other and keep going back to the second color. Just working it up and down the page and letting gravity naturally mix that aquatic paint into itself. There you go, the 3 different types of washes. Now, before we go to the wash around wet, I want you to fill in the wash around the dry shape with a color. It doesn't matter which one. And we're going to let that dry, leave it alone for now, and go over to the wash around wet. Now, let's imagine that you're trying to complete a still life and make a due date, meet the expectations of the teacher and submit it in on time, and you're rushing. And if you do that and you go and paint around a section that's already wet, you might have some unwanted bleeding effect. But if you're patient with watercolors, as with most forms of art, and you let a section dry before painting around it, you can avoid bleeding when you don't want it. When you're going for a wet on wet technique, it looks lovely, but if you don't want it, it can ruin a painting. I hope you enjoyed this Watercolor Techniques tutorial video. Feel free to leave your questions, comments, and compliments in the box below. Please click on like and share if you found this video at all helpful. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel. There'll be more videos coming. Thanks for watching.